Welcome. It's interesting to hear the echo of one's voice in a room such as this. It's always at the Institute we talk about resilience, and I guess this is basically a test of resilience where you have been asked to move from a 45-person room to a 450-person room. So we adapt as always, but I'm happy that we have you sitting in front of us, because what we have today for you is very closely connected to what's going on in room 10, the learning crisis, to act now. That room is crowded, and I went to see what was going on in that room. And the good news that I bring from that room is that they acknowledge that we have a problem. We have a learning crisis, that more than 60% of our children are not able to read and comprehend at the age of 10 at the level that they should. And in many countries, that goes up to 80%. And with the COVID, it's even, the situation is more dire. Now, the bad news is that when I hear some of the interventions, a lot of it is really outdated. It's not been supported by the latest science and evidence that's coming out. Take an example, the Reading Recovery Program. There's a problem with it, and there's recent articles in many of the journals where they were saying why that whole intervention program has failed, and how we need to respond accordingly based on the latest research that's coming out from the sciences of learning, as well as even the social scientists, in terms of context, because context plays such an important role in the way that we intervene. The other major myth, in a sense, of phonics, like the gold standard for literacy, that's also becoming under increasing question by the academic community, saying it's not, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. And the whole notion of a whole language approach seems to be one that's been advocated right now. So I think what's really scary is this whole notion of it, the lack of bringing in science, a lack of bringing in replicable evidence, not just evidence, that you have to be able to replicate it, because that's only when it becomes best practice. It's all missing out there. So this is what we're going to talk about today. I have a very distinguished panel with me here today. Really excited. They have always been supporters of the Institute. I have a problem with visuals, spatial. So I have to always use my hand to think right and left. So I'm one of those kids who had to have special interventions in school. So on my left, I have Vera Lacuin. I'm sure many of you know her, the Deputy Permanent Delegate of St. Lucia at UNESCO. Then on my right, immediate right, I have Michel Bonson, representative of the government of Quebec and the permanent delegation of Canada at UNESCO. Quebec government has been extremely supportive of the work that we do. And then on my extreme right, I have Adam Almula, the ambassador, permanent delegate of Kuwait at UNESCO. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Vera to say a few words.
Thank you, Alonta. My dear colleagues, good afternoon. Thank you for being with us. I'm just going to say a few introductory words, maybe to explain to those who don't know how this report came about and how we got involved with it. The Secretary General of the United Nations said that things are not working in education. He basically said, we're not doing the right thing. And this was even before COVID. So you can imagine that after COVID, the situation worsened. And as Ananta just told you, and as they were saying in the room next to us, everybody is realizing that we have a crisis and that we need to transform education and the way we do things. And the problem we have so far is we had until we got this report, from my perspective at least, is that no one is answering the question of how. And I think that this report, to a great extent, help us in this regard. When the discussion started in UNESCO a few years ago about the future of education, we immediately, in the executive board, said repeatedly that we are no longer interested in opinions. Investing in education is a big investment for countries, especially countries like ours. And to see the impact, you have to wait a long time. And we are no longer ready to wait 10 or 20 years to discover whether we have been rightly advised by UNESCO or not. We told them, we need your policy advice, your standard setting instruments, everything, your reports, everything we produce, and actually not just for education, but especially for education. We needed to be evidence-based. We needed to be science-based. We need to be sure that we're going to start something, start implementing policies, start reviewing curricula, start retraining teachers, being sure. We're never 100% sure, but at least we have a science-backed formula that will help us move, thinking at least that we're doing the right thing. So the board decided to commission a world report called the Futures of Education report. And we had a big discussion about this report because we understood that the report was going to be philosophical, very intellectual, philosophical, and we'll set the philosophical setting for the futures of education. So we applauded and we said that's good because this is also necessary to have a philosophical vision that will set the scene, but then that's not enough. And that is how in the board we very much insisted. We put it in the decision and we repeated it in our plenary debate that we needed a global independent evaluation of education because we need to really go from a dot where we move forward with methods and with policies that are evidence-based and science-based. So this is how we got the Mahatma Gandhi Institute to start working on their this great achievement that they produced this report, because the Director General took this on board and made sure that this project could take place. And now we have this report, and clearly from the perspective and point of view of all those who read it, it is a major step forward in answering all the questions we have about how. And we do need this report to be more publicized. We need you to go to UNGA and show this report to the summit on transforming education, because we really do not want to come out again with the usual blah, 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 with no nothing concrete for us to implement and nothing concrete for us to go forward with for our kids. We suffered a lot from the pandemic. Things are even more complicated than before. And we really hope that now the whole educational landscape is going to get together and come up with something that is useful for us, because although there is this new global mechanism now for coordinating for SDG4, we do feel that they're still scattered. And I mean, one example I could give is an example we're living these 2 days. You will have great presentations in the plenary and the ministerial roundtables about the Futures of Education report. Nothing about this one. While for us, they really go together, because one without the other is not going to be useful. I mean, the Futures for Education report is a great report, but the only thing it recommends is another report. So this is not the way to go forward. And I think these two reports really have to be taken and communicated to member states together, for member states to have the full picture, the long-term vision, the big-scale vision, the philosophy, and then how to do something concrete on the ground with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vera. So I think Vera has kind of put it in terms of providing the basis for this report. I'll talk a little bit about the report, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues to go into more detail. Because at the end of the day, I think we have had enough of discussions about we need to do something. We have a learning crisis. It's important, the children, inclusive education. I've heard this word inclusive education to a point where I just don't understand what it is. All right. How the hell do you want to do inclusive education? As a father of a child who was diagnosed with acute dyslexia, I understand the frustrations, and no education system has put into place a process to at least accommodate. And this is not just one kid or not. There is a huge number of kids. It's not, those numbers are large. And I think it's time that we actually have the tools that we need to do that. So I'm not sure who's controlling the slideshow. So can we go right up to the front? So the second slide. So this is what we have heard. We know about this. So this is the good news, that we acknowledge that we have a major problem. And it was good that COVID actually brought this up to the fore, because even pre-COVID, the numbers were a little bit staggering. But it was always kind of hidden under the things about enrollment, the usual assessments, the learning assessments that are conducted. But this particular statistic, I think, became quite a crisis, and this is what they're talking about in room 10. Next slide, please. Now, as I've already alluded, and Vera has also exemplified, is the role of science and evidence. So we know best practices. We hear the word best practices like, through our years, right? But what does that mean? Has a best practice gone through a rigorous scientific evaluation? When I say the word scientific, I'm talking about a process, a structured, logical, rational process, where you use the evidence and to sort of say, and when you want to say if it's best practice, then it has to be replicable across multiple scenarios. Otherwise, it's so dangerous to take it from one scenario to another scenario. So it has to go through a very rigorous process. And we have those standards within the scientific community. So we put together this assessment. Well, we use the word assessment here, but it's not about learning assessments. The assessment here is about a method review of the education system. Something similar like what the IPCC does for climate change. We did something for education. It has never been done before. I was shocked. I'm not an educationist. I come from the environment and economics field, and I was shocked that something like this has not been done for a global social good. We have to do it, because otherwise we don't know what are the gaps, where the strengths, so forth and so on. And one of the things that came out of this, now this took 2.5 years to complete. We had about 300 over experts, 45 countries, 10 disciplines, and believe me, getting experts from 10 disciplines together in a room to discuss and come to some consensus about those issues. My beard, which was completely black 2.5 years ago, has turned white. We had such discussions that one should not even record it. But we had to do it. And this is why transdisciplinary is so important. Just having an expert write a paper on a topic and say this is the way to do it is very dangerous. You need to get that consensual. And I always talk about consensual science because there's so much of uncertainty. We need that kind of a consensus. A lot of the scientists did not agree with many of these results, with the key messages, with the recommendations. But overall, among the 300, they felt confident to go ahead with these key messages and recommendations. Next page. So it's 4 volumes, 1,200 pages. It's so difficult to get academics to write simple messages in short documents. But we did produce a summary for decision makers, a 50-page, and then a 7-page headliners, which you have in front of you. Now, there were many key messages and many recommendations. What we thought would be useful is to zero in on one which is so important to the learning crisis, to that numbers that we saw. And the key message is every learner learns differently. This is this is not a brain teaser. You know, individual differences. I learn differently from Vera, I learn differently from others. So if you look at the Universal Declaration, 1946, Article 26, you talk about education as a human right. And in fact, now UNESCO keeps saying education is a human right. It's personalized education, which is a human right. Not just education is a human right. Because if you give me an education which is not situated to what I have, that is a violation of my human rights. So in many ways, we are violating human rights. Because if it's not personalized, you're not doing Article 26. And the next one, which we really was, for me, was a minor revelation. And in fact, for a lot of educationists, is learning is a cognitive emotional process. It's just not cognitive. When I learn maths, emotions play a role in that learning process. And the science supports it. There's evidence to support it. And there's a new number of papers which say learning is affected by emotions and emotion affects learning. It's a two-way process. It's no longer the thinking brain, the emotional brain, and so forth. It's about neural networks across the different parts of the brain. When we know that, then our whole learning pedagogy curriculums all have to change accordingly to that. So when we talk about transformative education, this is what we're talking about. It's not about just revising the curricula as we see it. It requires a total transformative change in pedagogy, in curricula, in how we assess the kids, those pesky exams that we have, the thing that is called PISA that continues to dominate. We should get rid of it. Put me on record. Get rid of PISA. Next message. So universal screening was something that we came up very strongly among the community of 300 experts. Do it very early on and do it consistently. Just don't do it one time and then that's it, consistently. My colleagues here are going to tell you what is universal screening and what you should not get mixed up with universal screening and other terms, and how you do it. We have done a prototype universal, like a guideline, step by step, on how to do universal screening. So over to you, Nandini and Amira.
Okay, thanks so much, Ananta, and good afternoon to all of you. So I'm Amara Martinez. I'm very new with the NJIP. I have been here since last week, in fact, and I'm the Senior Program Officer. This session is really meant to be an interactive one, where we really get to engage with all of you in the room to find out what you know about universal screening, but also what you don't know. And I think really it is about us going through this journey together so that we can really be appraised of what exactly universal screening is. So as Ananta said, it's meant to get a little bit more in detail about what universal screening actually is, and just to give you an opportunity to interact with us. But I think the purpose of today is really just to also get us going as we start on this particular journey. You would see that there is a white slide in front of you, which is really the Wi-Fi password. And there's a reason for this. We are going to be using a set of polls to gauge information from all of you and to find out your particular views on universal screening. So I am going to ask you at this point, if you can please take out your mobile phones. And this session will be an shared co-facilitation between myself and my partner, Nandini, who you will see there. And she will come in, she's the expert. She knows more about this stuff than what I do, but really it provides you a little bit more in-depth information about what we're actually trying to do. So we'll be using a few polls, as I said. If you can get your mobile phones out at this point, you would also see that there is a 10 card right in front of you. If you don't have one, we can provide you with one. So this is the card that you should be looking for. There are 2 QR codes here. I want you to use the first one that says participate in polls. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds just to organize yourselves and to tell me if you don't have a 10 card in front of you. And then I want you to start clicking on this particular poll. Are you clear?
William, could you share your card in the middle with the lady on the left? Thank you.
You should have about one per table. If you don't have one, I can provide you with one.
So I think one of the purposes of using this engagement session is also to begin to bring to fore the whole idea, how important engagement is in learning and communication. Okay, so classrooms really need to become more dialogic in nature. So think of this as a little classroom where we are trying to learn together about universal screening, and please do participate in the polls.
Yeah, and I think just to echo what Nandini says, please don't feel that it is an us versus you situation. It's meant to be an interactive session. Please feel free to jump in during the presentations, during our session, and ask questions. There is no right or wrong. So please just give me an indication of when you've logged in and made your choice. There are 2 answers, quite simple, yes or no. Have you heard of universal screening? So that's our first question.
Mara, do you think we should put one 10 card on the table to have our panelists participate
Absolutely.
too? So maybe we can share one from the...
You'll use this one. The first QR code. Are you all getting there? I don't see anybody online as yet.
Your answer will begin to show up here.
Yeah.
So the evidence for your participation will be up there.
And I think because we're so small, it's going to be very difficult for us not to know that you haven't done it. So please log in. Let us also know if you're having some issues. Not showing? Okay.
Yeah, try to refresh.
And as you know, these types of things do happen. Maybe just to give us a show of hands in the room, I think we are a small enough number to actually do this. So how many of you in the room have actually heard about universal screening? If you can just give a show of hands. So about 3 of you.
There, it's showing up.
There we go. Okay, so I see 16 people voted. Thank you for that. So 56% of you, more than half of you, have not heard about universal screening. And I must say, just to give you a little bit of background about where I'm coming from, I was a public servant in the South African government for quite a number of years. And before I came to NJIP, I actually didn't know what the difference was between a learner assessment and universal screening. So I am probably part of that 56%, just so you know. And I think this is an important revelation because while we are in the education space, we may not always know the terms for things. We might be doing it in our space and in our countries, but we may not actually know what the technical terms are. And I think this is a very, very important observation as well. So I really want to also, think about what this means in terms of IC. And I'm going to hand over to my partner, Nandini, just to give you a little bit more detailed information about what this is, and just to also give you some insight on things that you may not have known about, because as we saw, over half of you actually don't know what it is, including me. So over to you, Nandini.
Thank you very much, Amara. So just to assure you that I have some level of training in being able to answer this question, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Nandini Chatterjee Singh. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist by training. And I trained in physics before that and then moved on to study neuroscience. And I've been with MGIP now for 6 years, where we've been working on science and evidence-based approaches to improve learning, and was part of the IC assessment too, as part of Working Group 1 on human flourishing. And my particular area of interest has been universal screening as part of my earlier research work. And one of the most important findings out of the IC assessment was, and this is particularly because we were able to take this transdisciplinary approach, that every child learns differently, the point that Ananta made right at the beginning. Okay. And in order for a teacher to be able to give the child what they need, which is something we don't do right now, it's important to conduct a universal screening. What do children come with in the classroom? And how do we make sure that teachers are equipped to cater to the needs of the child? And there is ample research to show, which was cited in the IC, that when teachers know what children need, they are able to cater to the needs of the child much better. And the earlier you do it, and this is something I want to emphasize, the sooner you do a universal screening, the better are the chances of being able to meet the needs of the child. And therefore, this forms the basis of inclusive education. Okay. So the universal screening is now recognized worldwide, scientifically, as a formalized process through which teachers and educators use standardized tools. Okay. And these are performance-based tools. It's not just meant to take a survey. You want to know what a child coming in your classroom is able to do. Is he able to use the toilet? Is he able to express when he's unhappy? Is he able to recognize patterns of sounds? These are all parts of universal screening. And so the purpose is to identify student needs. These needs might be neurobiological, so they might be because of the way the child's brain is wired, or they might be because of the environment. Okay. So what do we mean by that? Archana, can we go to the next slide, please? So when we are trying to gauge learner needs, it's important to know whether the child is a first-generation learner. Okay. Is the child coming from a home where nobody has ever had any exposure to print, in which case when the child goes home, is that child getting any support to do schoolwork? Okay. Is there any way that the child is being exposed to play? Okay? Because play provides a great way for the brain to develop and the child to learn. Do parents participate in that learning, or is the child just left to themselves to learn? And finally, and something that has begun to really intrigue and plague learning is stressful or the environment at home. Stress has become a very major factor, which has begun to not only impact learning, but even brain development. Even brain growth is impacted by stress. And there's a wealth of data to be able to support it. So the idea of a universal screening process is to put into place a simple mechanism, and we'll talk about this in a minute about how it's different from learner assessment, is how can a district or a school system or a country put into place a universal screening mechanism so that teachers can conduct it quickly. And this is really a great place where technology can come into fore and support us to understand what the structure of the classroom is. How should the teacher go ahead and teach in the classroom so that you are able to meet the needs of, I emphasize, all learners, not just the top learners, not just one learner, but all learners. So we want to assume that every child has different needs, but the teacher is equipped to be able to answer and address those needs. So that's what the universal screening process is. It is not a diagnosis. It is an assessment of the child's needs. Okay, the teacher is addressing what the needs of the child are. So that's what we want to do. And over the next couple of slides, we'll hopefully share with you how we will try and do those processes and put them in place. What will be the domains underlying that? Back to you, Amara.
I think one of the things that really struck me about what you said was about the environmental factors. And in other words, context. So coming from a country like South Africa, which is obviously quite highly unequal, what we see is that there are multiple deprivations at play. It's not just that you are somebody from a poor society, it's also that you are poor, but you also have access to low quality schooling. You don't have access to transport to get you to schooling. You don't have access to connectivity. So it's not as simple as just saying, I need this for this purpose. And I think with the COVID pandemic, what we saw is that all of these factors were exacerbated. And I think this is something that we really shouldn't forget. What COVID really taught us was that it was almost a blessing in disguise, because all of the factors that we're talking about here were actually raised up to a point where we're saying that learning about social and emotional skills, learning about the other soft skills, as some people see it, is actually as important, and if not more important than literacy and numeracy. So I said to you guys earlier about, this idea of learner assessment versus universal screening. And as I said, coming from a government setting and working in the policy space with politicians and decision makers, one of the things that we were really pushing for was how many kids actually have a good passing rate in grade 10. And so this is about literacy, it's about numeracy, but we never really assessed for the other behavioral factors. We really didn't talk about socio-emotional skills. We didn't teach them about resilience, about challenge seeking. How do you actually motivate learners to come out of the poorest situations that they find themselves in to actually tackle these particular challenges? And so I think this is important for us, as we go forward, to really understand quite innately the difference between learner assessment as well as universal screening. So Nandini gave you a very nice picture of what we're actually looking for and described in quite a level of detail in terms of what universal screening is. But what I'd really love to know, Nandini, is the difference between learner assessment as we know it, as decision makers. That is what we strive for. We want to say that as South Africa or as Colombia or as Saudi Arabia, we are achieving a pass rate in mathematics of 80% or whatever it is. But are we really looking at the other factors? And so, I want to hand over to you, Nandini, to take us through this and what this means.
Thank you so much. And you raise a very pertinent question. It's something that almost every policy maker that we have talked to about universal screening says, of course we do assessments in classrooms. But how is universal screening distinct from learner assessments? Archana, could you move on to the next slide? So here is laid out for you specific factors that separate universal screening from learner assessments. So the very first point is universal screening, like I said, is meant to identify the needs of the learner, to identify their strengths and their weaknesses, which are important for both cognitive development and their learning and brain growth. Okay. On the other hand, a learning assessment is meant to infer what the student has been taught. Okay. That's the first difference. Universal screening must include different domains of brain development. They includes academic skills, social skills, emotional skills, behavioral skills. On the other hand, primarily as of now, and this is something we're not addressing but needs to certainly be addressed, learning assessment primarily focuses on academic needs. So the emotional behavioral needs are getting completely left out. And as a dear colleague of mine says, what is not assessed is not addressed. Okay. So therefore, until we get a flavor and understanding of what is missing in the child, what the child needs, we will not be able to provide it. It is important that universal screening be short, okay, because it needs to be done multiple times in a year. Learner assessment, on the other hand, is a long process. It could be 45 minutes, it could be an hour, it could be 3 hours, it could be formative nature, it could be summative in nature. On the other hand, universal screening is simple performance-based stuff, which you can probably do sitting with a child, even sitting across in a room. Okay? It's like when somebody visits you and you talk to the child for a few minutes just to be able to make friends with the child. But in those 5 minutes, you've already gauged whether the child has social skills, whether the child is able to make eye contact with you, does the child understand language. In just 3 or 4 minutes of interaction, you gather that. Okay. How can we put this into a structured approach so that the teacher can get collective information about this? You want to use tools that have been standardized, okay, so that you have looked at a large number of children, not 25 children, but thousands of children, so that you have growth patterns on what children at 5 years can do, 7 years can do, and 9 years can do. And this becomes very pertinent when you look at the difference between the children who come in from maybe lower socioeconomic classes who may not have had that exposure. Should we expose them to the same standards? Is it not fair to be able to understand what their needs are to provide them and to make sure that they reach those same growth curves? So that's something that we need to be able to do. And finally, based on this, to be able to design quick intervention plans. And we will talk in a minute about how, using universal screening, you can adopt a tiered approach. So you can find groups of children who benefit from collective intervention, okay, so that their needs might be met. Again, I emphasize, we do not mean to label, but we want to see which groups of children we need what and make sure we are able to provide it at the right pace, at the right level. Okay, so that's where universal screening is different and very distinct from learner assessment. Can we move on?
For that, Nandini. Again, I want to make it quite practical and kind of look back to some of my experience in South Africa, looking at particularly what, and picking up on what Ananda said earlier, having universal screening early on in a child's life is of utmost importance. What we find in South Africa, as an example, was that we were looking at ECD as a very singular thing. So ECD, or early childhood development, was really seen as something that wasn't really that important. And obviously, you know, there are things within a government space like political will. Do the politicians and decision makers see ECD, or early childhood development, as a key priority of a government? And that can be translated through any other government. Or do they see it as something that's not that important? What we found was that, you know, learners were coming to grade 1 and they couldn't they couldn't actually pick up a pencil. They didn't know how to play. They weren't actually achieving the milestones that they were meant to be achieving at that particular age, which is age 5. And so really thinking about what did we need to do to be able to assess whether this particular child was able to go into grade 1. And what we then came up with was universal screening, in fact, to think about how can we actually look across a segment of the population, particularly younger children, to find out where do we need to place them and are we placing them in the right areas. And I think this is very important. As you said, Nandini, it's about understanding the characteristics. It's about understanding these differences between screening and learner assessment. So I'm going to invite you now, and I promise there's only 3 polls, and we're on the second one now, to do our second poll, which is really coming back to this question about, do you do universal screening in your respective countries? So I want to invite you now again to whip out your mobile phones and please just scan the QR code and then move on to the next one. So Archana, you can move on. Yes, please go ahead.
When we go to the next question, it doesn't show.
Okay, can we just refresh it?
Do we have to scan again? And
yeah, what you can do is once we've moved over, the question will pop up on your mobile device.
Okay.
Just let me know if it's not there. Okay. I'll give you about 30 seconds just to take you through this one. Same question. Okay, we tried. Right, so maybe let's just do it this way again. If we can just do the old school way of doing it, if you can just raise your hands and then we can get an assessment of how many of you actually do conduct universal screening. So why we're asking this question is about, based on what Nandini has just said, based on what the differences are between learner assessment and universal screening, do you think that you are doing that in your respective countries? Can you just show your hands? I think that's going to be the easiest. Okay, we've got 1. Yes. 2, 3. No, 3. Yes. So those of you that do conduct universal screening in your country, put your hand up. 2, 3. So we still at 3. So essentially, I think what that means is that most of you don't. And this is not an uncommon occurrence. I think it is something that, we are trying to push for, and exactly why we are here today. So I think it is important, for those of you that do want to screen, and I'm assuming that you came to this session because you either want to know more about it, or you are already deploying screening in your respective countries, or just to find out a bit more about it. And I think that's super important as well. So out of those, and we meant to go to our third poll, but I don't suppose that's going to work. So I'm just going to go ahead the old school way. For those of you that do want to screen, are there particular things that you want to screen for? So what do I mean by this? Do you want to look at literacy? Do you want to look at numeracy? Do you want to look at social and emotional skills? Or do you want to assess behavioral challenges within the classroom, or a combination of both? So I think this is also something that perhaps, if I look at my own assessment, is we were fixated with how kids are doing on literacy and numeracy skills. We didn't care that much about social and emotional stuff. And I think at the end of it, once we've changed our administration, what we then did was a combination of both. So then it was looking at literacy, numeracy, and social and emotional skills. Again, these factors about how do you look at challenge-seeking behaviors? How do you motivate kids to do better? How do you build resilience in terms of getting kids, when they are coming from poorer households, to actually look at the environment as an opportunity rather than a circumstance? And so I do want to also just let you think about that and then hand over straight to Nandini just to give us a little bit of insight in this. And I think that when we think about universal screening and learner assessment and what those domains are, I think it's important just to understand it a bit more. So I'm sorry that the polls didn't work, but I think let's go on and hand over to Nandini.
We've already talked about the whole brain learning approach, and it was one of the most important findings of the IC. And I think the COVID crisis just confirmed and reaffirmed how important social and emotional learning is for not just children to be able to learn better, but to be able to become wholesome human beings. Okay, so the fact that learning is now a cognitive emotional process has been absolutely established without doubt. Okay, and therefore it's important. Archana, can we go to the next slide? That universal screening include two broad domains. One is a global domain, which looks at social, emotional, and behavioral constructs, which impacts everything. It's how you behave, how you grow up, how you interact in society, how you learn in the classroom, how you make friends, how you make relationships. Everything is impacted by the global domains. Whereas if you think about it, learning in school has focused on academic domains only. Okay, we've been obsessed with reading, writing, and mathematics. Okay, whilst it may end up finding you a great job, I'm afraid it might not end up making you a happier individual or being able to form good relationships. And in some cases, might not even actually promote learning. And therefore, in the recent years, these have come to emphasize, in fact, if not dominate, the fact that social emotional learning, which includes global domains, must become a primary feature in order to conduct universal screening. So now we recognize that there are multiple domains that a good universal screening instrument needs to include. That's the reason we are putting this up there, so that when you do go back to your countries and want to implement universal screening, you do not just focus on seeing whether the child can read or do numbers, but you also notice whether the child can regulate emotions, recognize emotion, have a vocabulary for emotions, be able to communicate that. How do you know when a child shakes hands with somebody else? How much pressure they know how to put on the hand of the other person? It's the basis for forming a new friend in school. Very little things that they are important for us to be in society, because humans are essentially social emotional beings, become a crucial aspect and form the basis of the different screening domains. We've laid out a few of these for you up on the slide, but the guidelines that we've put together actually talk about these in greater detail. So a good universal screening instrument must have all these domains included in that. Mara, would we like to move on? So since we started on this process, maybe what I will quickly do for you in the next 5 minutes is to lay out for you what is the process that goes into play to be able to implement universal screening in your country. Okay. So first is to identify the fact that we are going to conduct universal screening and to identify and come up with a transdisciplinary team that will discuss on what are going to be the features of this universal screening and how this is going to be implemented, what's going to be the timeline for it. Then you go back and inform the necessary school structures. You also inform necessary parents that children are going to be screened for these features. You develop a protocol, and there are standardized tools that can be used here to develop the protocol. Protocol is essentially a process of steps that will be administered to the child. You run the pilot protocol to see that it actually works. Is half an hour enough? Are we able to get all the necessary information? So you use against the science and evidence-based approach to be able to establish the process before it gets scaled. So you run a pilot to be able to establish the process before it gets scaled. Following that is where the whole important feature of it comes out. Once you've administered it, you will be able to see children will fall into groups, okay? And we'll talk about the tiered intervention in a minute. That tiered intervention is what the teacher is going to use to be able to structure the learning in his or her classroom. Okay. And there's a process that we're going to do for that. Following that, so it's not that the process is over now. After the teacher has become aware on what to do in the classroom, the teacher implements it. But how do you know it's working? That's what we started out with in the beginning. So after 3 months or 6 months, that's what the team identifies. Maybe after 6 months, you redo the screening and see whether the child has moved in their learning process. The things that the child needed, were they provided in the right measure, and did that change happen? Which is why the instrument needs to be quick and short so the teacher can see that learning. If not, then there is a tweak to be implemented. Okay? And that's how you ensure that the monitoring process begins to inform the intervention and the child begins to learn. Because ultimately, we just want to make sure that no child is left behind. Okay? So the important part is that gradually you are now trying to get to this notion of personalized learning. Okay? You're trying to tailor interventions such that you are able to meet the needs of the child, but might be changing a little bit. A child might not have been traumatized when you started the first screening, but maybe something happened in the 6 months and you might find the child has had a loss in the family and needs additional intervention. And that's where you bring it in. So let me tell you quickly what the 3 tiers are in which children typically fall into when you implement universal screening. Archana, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so you've gotten the screening data after you've implemented it, okay? And children typically, and I want to emphasize the word typically, fall into 3 groups. Most learners at specific age groups, so if you're doing it at 5 years or 7 years, 80% of your class will fall into that lowmost age group, okay? Most kids are doing what in terms is called neurotypically, okay? There are some kids who have risk factors, and that's roughly about 15%. And then there are 5% of kids who often fall off the ladder. Okay, those are the kids we are trying to protect. Okay, and therefore we want to start out with the approach that imagine if your entire classroom got that kind of intervention, then everybody would be catered to. But the idea is to try and make sure that the kids who might be at the fringes don't fall off. It's only then will education become inclusive and equitable. The child who is a first generation learner, who is facing a whole new set of challenges, might be sitting into that 15% group, but with intervention might quickly move to the 80% group. Okay, how do we keep monitoring that? That is going to be the basis for achieving inclusion and equitable learning. Okay, everybody always talks about the 80%. What happens to the remaining 20%? Do we just forget about them? Okay, but some of those kids are the gifts of our society. You know, there is evidence now to show that maybe Newton and Einstein also suffered from some of these issues. Okay, but we need to have those people brought in. You'll be surprised to know 80% of people in Harvard School of Astrophysics are dyslexics because they have an amazing ability to visualize large patterns. They can see patterns in the sky across stars, which you and I can't pick up, but they're dyslexic. They have problems reading. So do we just let go of them? So how do we make sure those kids are protected and are nurtured so that they can provide and be provided a chance to achieve their full potential? That's really what universal screening is trying to do, to enable every child to be able to achieve their full potential. And that we think is the right of every learner that comes into the world today. So that's really the basis and the motivation for universal screening. Amara, to you.
Thank you so much for that, Nalini. Sure. I think it also gives us...
There's a question.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very delighted to be here today. I am fascinated by the universal screening, and I think it should be the way forward. Now, if you allow me, I know that I'm interrupting here in the middle, but I do have an appointment that I have to leave for. But I have something to say. Definitely, I mean, the idea of having highly contextual assessment, like when you said eye contact, it may be different in different cultures, or handshake, etc. And I like the fact that it is applicable to different backgrounds and that it's not one size fits all.
Absolutely.
And it is how it should be, and I fully agree with it. Now, if I move from the science part, because you are the scientist, and I really admire the work that you have done, and I want to move now to the other part, which is the political part and what entails in the financial also standards. Today we are here discussing this very amazing, brilliant outcome and way of thinking. It requires political will from leaders, not only from ministers of education, actually from leaders at the higher level, from international organizations, and also because it requires capacity development for teachers. Some of them don't do any assessment at all, not even universal screening. They have to, understand it, even if it's short, even if it's user friendly. It is as good as you utilize it and as good as you implement it. It requires also continuous follow-up. It requires not only having one minister following up with it, and then when the cabinet changes, someone else, adopt something else. So I think it needs a political will at the higher level for the financial and the commitment part. Having said that, we are now having the Transforming Education Summit in New York. And I think it is very important for delegations to know what you are doing very clearly. Mm-hmm. Now, having this session today is very important, but it's not enough. And I think maybe if I look at it from practical solutions, and I see the way our delegation work, for example, we receive a letter, we see it, we see exactly what is wanted from this letter, we study it, we put our recommendation, we send it to the capitals, and then we follow up. Simple process. And I think if the delegations respond more to, unfortunately, to letters rather than exchanging ideas. So I think it's very important before the Transforming Education Summit to send something to all delegations in this regard, requesting them to consider having something in the leaders' declaration that is coming out of the Transforming Education Summit that links evidence and science to the way forward, or even better, mention the screening. And I think if they do, it will be, amazing. If they don't, I think if we stick with science and evidence, this will be at least an open a room for us. And have the political will, have something said, leaders have committed to that. We've seen it in the SDGs, we've seen it with other conventions. And I think it proves an open room for other ministers or leaders or NGOs or educators who want to adopt this once the political will has been made. Other than that, the methods, the outcomes, the outcomes of the discussions and the consultations that you have done, it's brilliant. Now, how can we move to the practical and implementation part? And that's where we are here to help. From our part, definitely we're going to convey this to the capital. Definitely we're going to talk to them about trying to find a way that we can at least have something in the declaration that says that, but most importantly, the commitment from UNESCO itself and from the UN headquarters in New York is very important in this regard. So I wish you all the luck in talking to these organizations, but from our part, from the capital's part, we're going to talk to our delegations or to our capitals in this regard. We want to push this forward. So with that, I would like to thank you all very much and I apologize for leaving early. This is very interesting. I really don't want to leave. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you a quick question? Do you know how to make copies of yourself? Then we can send one of you everywhere.
Oh,
and
there's more.
Get
there is
across.
more. I'm sure there is more. But and I wish there was more people here today to see that. But definitely, again, please do send something to all delegations. They do read letters. They convey it to their capitals. I think it will create a change.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank
Nita,
you.
Would you like
Thank
to
you very
comment?
Well, I would, that was my conclusion. So I don't think I need to conclude at the end of this meeting because that's exactly what I wanted to say.
I think the one thing, just as a wrap up of the session, is really to say that, that hits the nail on the head. It's about we all know about the what. You know, a lot of conversation happens about the what, but very little happens about the how. And I think that's the point that you made, Vera. It's about how do you do this practically? How do you look at the other elements besides just getting things out there, like political will? Same thing happens in my country. You need to play this game to be able to get things done and land things. And that's unfortunate, but it's reality. And I think with that, if there's enough of us in the room saying the same thing, perhaps it will go somewhere. And I think that this is something that we should, as a small collective, be able to do. So with that, I'm going to say thank you for your participation. Next time, I hope it's going to be a bigger group and we can create a collective of like-minded people. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Ananta. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandini Amara. In terms of for the time, I was going to present a 3-hour lecture presentation, but unfortunately, my colleagues are not going to agree to that. I'm going to ask Michelle to say a few things because the government of Quebec has been extremely supportive of this whole assessment process right from 2019 September when we had the first workshop hosted by the chief scientists of the government of Quebec.
Merci Ananta. Je tiens à saluer tout le monde dans cette salle, dans la salle virtuelle. Je tiens à nouveau à féliciter toutes les personnes qui ont travaillé de près ou de loin à ce fabuleux rapport et au premier chef, Ananta et son équipe. Un rapport de 300 experts, en fait, qui ont participé à sa rédaction, de 45 pays, un rapport de plus de 1000 pages. Un rapport qui nous dit beaucoup de choses, notamment, comme on en a discuté aujourd'hui, sur l'importance du dépistage précoce, centré sur l'élève pour apporter les bonnes réponses en tenant compte de la particularité de chaque élève. Donc, c'est ambitieux. C'est ambitieux, ça prend des ressources et ça, c'est clair, mais l'idée de base est quand même assez extraordinaire. Pour accompagner par la suite, donc donner un accompagnement personnalisé à chaque élève, ce qui est souhaitable. Maintenant, bien sûr, ça prend des ressources, comme je viens de le dire, et de guider l'enfant en fonction de ses forces et ses faiblesses. On a entendu, je crois que c'est Ananta qui a parlé du one size fits all, et je pense que c'est pas souhaitable. Hein? On est tous des êtres humains différents, avec un parcours différent, une éducation différente, des ressources différentes. Donc, c'est important que les systèmes éducatifs s'adaptent. J'ai retrouvé un rapport du Conseil supérieur de l'éducation du Québec qui, en 2017, recommandait au gouvernement du Québec, et le titre était « Pour une école riche de tous ses élèves, s'adapter à la diversité des élèves ». Donc, c'est un rapport de 2017 où on faisait l'apologie de cette stratégie de développement. Pardon, comme Ananta vient de le dire, le gouvernement du Québec a été associé dès le début de l'exercice en 2019 à Montréal avec le support du scientifique en chef du Québec. Et le Québec a été de toutes les étapes lors du lancement, notamment il y a quelques mois ici à l'UNESCO, aujourd'hui, et lors d'une conférence internationale qui aura lieu du 18 au 20 juillet. Cette rencontre réunira les principaux collaborateurs, contributeurs et experts qui ont travaillé sur ce projet. Et 2 objectifs principaux. Donc, le premier, c'est de réunir l'expertise pour formuler une approche transnationale et transdisciplinaire pour élaborer un programme mondial de recherche en éducation, donc ancré à partir de la science et les preuves. Il y a des exemples dans d'autres domaines de projets de cette nature, comme en changement climatique avec le GIEC. Donc, en éducation, il n'y a pas eu d'initiative de la sorte. Le but est toujours d'influencer, on l'a dit un peu plus tôt, d'influencer les politiques publiques en matière d'éducation et toujours pour que ces politiques soient basées sur la science, sur les faits. Et ça, c'est fondamental pour l'évolution de notre humanité. En terminant, il y a également, je crois, si ma mémoire est bonne, un deuxième objectif à cette conférence, c'est de présenter une boîte à outils pour un dépistage universel. Donc, toujours pour renforcer le lien entre la science et l'éducation. Et une boîte à outils, en fait, c'est un outil concret qui pourra nous permettre d'atteindre les objectifs de l'ODD 4. Vera l'a dit un peu plus tôt. Il y a beaucoup de rapports, souvent, qui causent beaucoup, mais ça nous prend des trucs concrets pour accompagner celles et ceux qui sont sur le terrain et qui travaillent avec ces élèves. Je termine dans quelques instants. Je voudrais dire aussi à propos de la conférence, et c'est Vera aussi qui l'a mentionné un peu plus tôt, il ne faut pas qu'un rapport d'une telle envergure qui est si riche ne finisse sur une tablette. Donc, il faut le faire vivre. Il faut l'amener plus loin, ce rapport-là. Il faut que le rapport produise des trucs concrets. Et cette conférence-là a cet objectif-là d'amener le rapport un peu plus loin. Le sommet ou la conférence se terminera par une déclaration qui lancera un appel, en fait, pour un processus d'évaluation mondiale institutionnalisé, un programme de recherche mondial et une base de données mondiale de recherche pertinente et des projets de recherche transdisciplinaires pour aider les États membres. Le gouvernement du Québec est d'avis que l'éducation est fondamentale pour créer des sociétés égalitaires, inclusives, pacifiques et solidaires. Et c'est résolument vers cela que nous amène ce rapport qui a une approche globale assez extraordinaire. On dit apprendre à être, apprendre à connaître, apprendre à faire et apprendre à vivre ensemble. Je pense que c'est en réunissant tous ces aspects-là de l'éducation qu'on créera un monde meilleur pour celles et ceux qui vont nous suivre. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Michelle. Based on my limited French understanding, I believe you committed 5 million for the next 5 years. Is that right? It's interesting how you can interpret. Thanks, Michelle. I want to pass the floor to Ambassador Adam Mullah to sort of comment on what his reflections are on today's presentation and the way forward.
Thank you. And I'd like to also thank the previous speakers and the work. I'll be very, very brief. The reason I agreed to be in the podium is, because, I believe in what was presented from the day it was, I think, in what the soft launching for this one I first introduced. And the reason, the rationale, and whoever knows me, I'm always a practical process person, and I would like everything to be very clear and a systematic outcome. Everyone can be improved. This is my mindset since day one. If I look at the organization, that UNESCO, okay, UNESCO, is it a standard setting organization and that's it, or it can be standard setting and more engaged on the ground to have an effective outcome, results. I think it should be the second one. But let's say even if it was only standard setting, which is that's worst case scenario. Those standards, they should have been done in a very systematic, practical, effective way. And the reason I'm saying this, so when the member state implement them, they can move forward and improve. Otherwise, we will have a document. What I found that in the report, I can summarize it. It's the methodology. So I have two messages. The normal message and the heading agenda. The first message is, the approach for the universal screening, engaging all different disciplines. There is a clear path for, member states to have effective outcome. That's great. But also the heading agenda, the methodology in approaching things should be, I think, standard in this way, using the science, using the evidence. So you can, have an effective outcome. Otherwise, we will go through circles over and over. Saying that, I think, in this report or this approach, what's fascinates me is the clarity of the practical outcome, not just on the implementation part. We are lacking is the implementation. A lot of times we are focused on the policy here in Paris, and we forgot about the floor. We think, once we've done the recommendation or the report or the study, it's effective. Everyone report to their capitals, done. But we never look at the effectiveness afterward. And I think in this report is in the step-up direction and the methodology and the approach. That's why I'm here in the podium, looking forward to see it, like our colleagues from Saudi Arabia, is to have, the message and our leaders at the summit is, we should explore this approach. We should, have it. With that, I thank you. And we have 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much, Adam. The beauty of technology is the information is so instantaneous. And as we were discussing this, a colleague of mine, a professor in Canada, sends this as the latest from Science News. Dyslexia isn't a disorder. It's part of our species' cultural evolution, say researchers. People with dyslexia have brains that are specialized to explore the unknown, and this strength has contributed to the success and survival of our species. Now, this has been published in Science News. Now, and of course, which means it must have gone through some process. It must have gone through some reviews, and I'm sure there will be people who will kind of counter that and sort of say what are the nuances and stuff. But the fact is, this group of people, this dyslexic group, is that 5% in that multi-tier that this education system has completely ignored. And the sad thing is, as education is institutionalized, which has been done over the last 100 years or so, because prior to the institutionalization of education, these people thrived. But by putting in this system, we have actually killed the very few people who, as according to this, contributed to the success and survival of our species. So, our education system has put into place the extinction of our species. Thank you very much. Vera, do you have any last? Because you actually had, but you mentioned that.
Thank you, Ananta. But really, what I wanted to say was very eloquently said by the ambassador of Saudi Arabia. I think this report should go further and go beyond UNESCO. And I think this Transforming Education Summit that we are having in September in the UN should know about this report. We would like to see in the summary of the Secretary General something about insisting on science and evidence-based education in the way forward for transforming education. I think this is crucial now. We really cannot, I'm going to repeat it, I kept in every forum, I keep repeating it. We cannot rely on opinions anymore, even if they are the opinions of the biggest professors or whatever you want. We need to be sure that we are going to invest into education reform that's going to be the right one for our children. So I do very much agree with what the ambassador of Saudi Arabia said. I think in order to get this message into the summary of the Secretary General, because as you know, there will be no negotiated outcome of this summit, Transforming Education in New York in September. There's going to be a summary of the Secretary General that will feed in the future summit that will take place in 2023. And the only way to get this message in is through the speeches of our heads of states. I think we should all make the effort to make sure that this line, this message, is in as many speeches as possible in order to reach the conclusion and then to reach further the summits, the future summit later on. I think this is what we should work on. And with all due respect to UNESCO and to everyone else, I think the only way to carry this forward is through the member states. I think this is something we should do. Thank you.
I'm touched that Vera touched me when she talked about UNESCO. So you're making the link with me with UNESCO. Yes. If I can paraphrase what, in terms of, I think all three representatives, ambassadors were talking about, if I can say this, transdisciplinary science, because that's important. You can't have just a single discipline influencing education. And I think that's where the trouble has been in many of the organizations, is one particular groups has basically monopolized. So transdisciplinary science and even evidence, I would put a qualifier, replicable evidence, because it has to be replicated, is a necessary condition for inclusive, equitable, and quality education for 21st century education. I don't like the word transformative because I really don't understand what that thing means, transformative. I like inclusive because it tells what it is. I like equitable because I don't like equality, because equality is a problematic concept, but equity is strong, and quality. And for the 21st century, we don't want it for the 20th century. We've already moved on. And we know what the education for the 20th century skills needed, and they are basically outdated. They're not relevant anymore. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much. It doesn't matter numbers. It's about the quality, and go there and beat the, I can't say these things in public, people out there in terms of what the message is. Thank you.